Jæja, komið sæl. Ég ætla nú bara meðan að fólk að setjast í panelin, þá ætla ég svona aðeins að kynna þáttakendur hér í dag. Við ætlum sem sagt að fjalla stöðu mála í Rússlandi, má segja, og kannski einkum og sér í lagi huga að því hvaða afleiðingar svona þær sú þróun sem hefur orðið í stjórnmálum í Rússlandi á síðasta árum kann að hafa, bæði innanlands og utan. Aðal fyrirlesarinn hjá okkur í dag er Sergej Medvedev sem kemur frá Moskvu. Hann prófessor við skóla sem alltaf erfitt að þýða nafn skólans á rússnesku. Hann heitir eiginlega Æðri skóli hagvísinda sem hljómar mjög hátíðlega, en má segja að sé einn af svona þekktari og betri háskólum Moskvu og mjög framalega, myndi ég segja, á sviði hagfræði, stjórnmálafræði og slíkra greina. Sergej líka virkur í fjölmiðlum í Rússlandi. Hann með vikulegan sjónvarpsþátt á sjónvarpsstöð sem heitir Dost og þar vikulega með viðtalsþætti og hefur verið svona ómyrkur í máli stjórnmálaástandið og stjórnvöld og sem sagt bæði í fjölmiðlum og samfélagsmiðlum. Þannig hann ætlar að fjalla svona almennt ástandið. Ég ætla sjálfur að tala stuttlega fjölmiðla og leggja aðeins út af því hvað maður getur sagt fjölmiðla umfjöllun í Rússlandi. Síðan talar Maximilian Konrad sem ætlar að horfa á Rússland aldrei svona frá sjónarmiði Evrópu og Evrópusambandsins. En til að byrja með ætla ég að gefa Rósu Magnúsdóttur orðið. Rósa lektor við háskólan í Árósum í Danmörku og kennir þar rússnesk fræði, maður gjör það svo, eða rússlandsfræði. Og hún ætlar að byrja í dag og aðeins að velta vöngum yfir, hvað maður segja, sögu og samtíð í Rússlandi. Ég vildi bara gefa þér þá orðið, Rósa. Hún síðan ætlar að taka að sér að vera svona umræðustjóri eftir þegar við erum öll búin. Rósa, svo vel. Já, ég ætti kannski að segja strax þó að kynningin hafi verið hjá mér á íslensku, þá ætlum við núna að skipta yfir í ensku og allir fyrirlestrarnir verða á því tungumáli.
Takk, Jón. Thank you very much, Jón, both for the invitation and for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Rosa Magnúsdóttir and I'm associate professor in Russian studies at Aarhus University, but I'm an historian by training. And I'm finishing a book, for example, entitled Enemy Number One, Soviet Ideology and the United States of America, and that's focused on the post-war period. But Jon asked me, like he said, to maybe talk a little bit about the relationship between history and the contemporary in Russia. And I just sort of thought briefly about what to talk to you about. And I decided he also told me just to talk for a couple of minutes, so I'm not going to take a lot of your time. But I teach very regularly a course on Soviet history, which still attracts quite a large body of students. I guess partly because it's exciting, mysterious, but also I have come to realize, because for many of my students they could just as easily be choosing a course on the Middle Ages. It's the far past for students in Denmark anyway. But when we've covered the Soviet period, I take a full lesson to talk to them about sort of what Soviet nostalgia means in contemporary Russia, and pose the question, why is there nostalgia for Soviet times in contemporary Russia? And my students are quite clever. They usually come up with a bunch of answers, and the first one is and the most obvious perhaps for somebody like me who's interested in the Cold War, is the loss of the superpower status. I mean, Soviet people were proud to be a part of a superpower that was feared and respected on the global arena. And related to that, of course, is the loss of empire, which is strongly related to recent developments in Russia and ambitions to expand the Russian empire once again. And because the students have been focused on history, we find the roots of the nostalgia for Soviet times in the late Brezhnev period. And just to refreshen your memories, the late Brezhnev years were a happy time for very many Soviet citizens. There was no terror in Soviet society at the time, and people thrived on the communal spirit. There was friendliness, the collective was really everywhere, and a lot of people continue to contradict that with the loneliness that they feel in contemporary Russian society. And many people comment on the fact that building socialism in the 1970s and the 1980s was still considered to be a very noble task. You're participating in something that was really worth working for. And you were proud to be doing that for this great power, building socialism. And, you know, many people claim that they cared less about having freedom like it was understood in the West than being a part of this noble task. And there was, of course, a very strong social welfare system. There was cradle-to-grave social security, people were guaranteed a job, medical care, education, and access to pension. However miserable it was still there. So for people growing up in the Brezhnev era, which Gorbachev gave the label stagnation, the period of stagnation, or zastoy in Russian, this period indicated stability for a lot of Soviet citizens. And I'm not going to really go over the developments. You know what happens. We have the Gorbachev revolution, and we have the chaotic period of the 1990s. And what follows is really a strong search for a new national idea. And this loss of Soviet identity created this type of nostalgia that we're talking about. And for me, one of the most interesting things is some people focus a lot on this loss of ideology. Like I talked about this noble task that people, felt that they were being a part of, and now there's somehow no sort of belief system, if we want to identify ideology as such. And I was reading just a couple of weeks ago in Masha Gessen's new book, The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, and she recounts Boris Berezovsky's analysis of Russian politics from 2011, and he claimed the Russian regime has no ideology, no party, and no politics. It is nothing but the power of a single man. And to me, that's sort of the whole mission and what links Putin's sort of reclaiming parts of the Soviet past is precisely this loss of ideology. And we can maybe today talk a little bit about, in what terms we now have Putinism as a comparable ideology to some of the isms we had during Soviet times. But we are definitely looking at a society where elections are really just public occasions to remind Russians that Putin's popularity has been the regime's ultimate source of legitimacy, and to demonstrate the type of national unity that Putin has created out of this chaotic post-Soviet period. So those are sort of my reflections based on the courses that I teach and sort of the links from the late Soviet period to the contemporary Putin era. So I hope today, I'm looking forward to the actual papers, but I hope that we can also talk a little bit about the role ideology or the loss of ideology plays in contemporary Russia. So, thank you.
Well, thank you for this wonderful introduction and very correct questions put here. Because really, we need to talk about history, because as they say, Russia is a place where everything is changing every year, but nothing changes over centuries. And actually, I'm now quite grateful that I was trained as a historian and I teach history. And really, for me, the past 3 years, indeed the past decade, 15 years, has been a fascinating time to see the perennial models of Russian history resurfacing, re-emerging. So I'm reminded of the 19th century, of the Tsardom of Nikolai I. I'm reminded of, indeed, of the 16th century of the Tsardom of Ivan the Terrible. And indeed, these patterns of Russian history keep repeating themselves. And once again, Vladimir Putin and his policies and his regime have embodied some very deeply embedded matrix of Russian economy, of Russian politics and Russian history. And this is very interesting, but probably this is not quite the talk of not quite the topic of our today's conversation. The second point, which you also correctly point out, is the ideology, or rather lack thereof. Indeed, what's happening in today's Russia is, as its origin, it has a big ideological gap that has occurred following the demise of the Soviet Union. Because whether we like it or not, the communist ideology, later the socialist ideology, was a big, cohesive cement for the an explanatory model for the foreign policy behavior, for the cohesion of the society. And with the demise of the Soviet project and the ensuing sort of West-oriented, market-oriented turmoil, of course there was no ideology apart from the immediate, robber baron capitalism, the immediate theft, the immediate gain. Indeed, it's not an ideology, it's rather behaviorism, it's a set of sporadic reactions. And indeed, this kind of behaviorism has triumphed in Russian politics as well, which is now utterly unideological, unpolitical, unstrategic. If you look at Russia and China these days, it's a stark contrast of strategic planning and the total lack of planning. People in the political class in Russia do not think even beyond the Duma elections in 2016 or the presidential elections of 2018. Any longer-term planning is indeed impossible in Russia. So rather than ideology, I indeed would like to talk about psychology. We need to take a look at the psychological state of the Russian political class and of the Russian population in order to understand what happened with my country in the past year and a half. And indeed, I'm still coming to grips with the new reality. Because, the country I used to live in, where it was, started my academic activity, started my civil activity, where I was educated, which I left at one point and lived for many years in the West before returning back to Russia in 2004 in order to participate in this new reality. That was a totally new country, which indeed started largely here in Reykjavik. Right? It was the first crack in the ice, the Gorbachev-Reagan summit, and then everything which ensued, this entire cycle of reforms and transformation of Russia, in which we all believed that this is a new nation, that a new nation was born, with a new hope, with a new perspective. And what happened in the last year and a half? I see the total unraveling of this project of the past 25 or 30 years, because Putin had done precisely that. Disengaging Russia from the outside world, putting Russia in a state of isolation and confrontation with the world, bringing us from the world of future into the world of the past, in which only the contents of our mind, of our debates is, the victory over fascist Germany 70 years ago, or the Russian imperial grandeur. So indeed, I see everything which was done by Dayton, by Glasnost, by Perestroika, by the market reforms, by the 1980s, by the 1990s, even by Putin himself in the early 2000s. We see this all being leveled out. And the question is how this could have happened. In just 1 year, we're facing a totally different nation. A nation which I, as a sociologist and historian, I realize that I don't know this nation. That's totally new population. Well, it's the same old population which was out there, but I have to admit, like so many people, there was a crash of Sovietology when people couldn't have predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. I think very few people could have predicted the kind of transformation of Russia that happened in 2014 and 2015. The annexation of Crimea, war with Ukraine, Cold War with the West, nuclear threats was the West, military buildup was NATO, and chauvinism all over the country. Now, in trying, I'm just not an observer, but pretend to be an academic, I try to see the explanations of this, and I find a lot of this in psychology, in political psychology. If anyone's interested, I can, give you the link. I published an article in Russian in Отечественные записки, last issue of 2014, but it's also a shorter version I can send upon request. This report I translated into English. It's called Russian Ressentiment. So I think that for me, a big explanatory model is the Nietzschean notion of ressentiment. Indeed, it's very similar to when the political historians talk about Weimar Germany. They talk about the Weimar ressentiment, the kind of feeling and ideology, not ideology, but rather the psychological state of the nation, which was in Germany following the end of the Weimar Republic, following the end of the First World War, and in the 20s and the 30s, which brought fascism to power. And actually, I still am able to speak about this because I think quite soon the law will be adopted in Russia in which it will be criminally punishable to compare Stalinism and fascism. You cannot compare Stalin with Hitler or indeed make any references to fascism. So far, I'm free to speak about this. So, what is ressentiment? Nietzsche was writing about this in 1882 in his The Genealogy on Morals, and he was saying that this is a morality of slaves, revolt of the slaves, in which is embedded in the animosity, hostility of the subject towards something or someone which he sees as a cause of his grievance. In this case, the upper class, the masters. So it's the hatred of the slaves towards the masters. It is a powerless envy, which grows out of the complex of inferiority. And indeed, there is a lot of literature on ressentiment, and Max Scheler, another German philosopher, was writing a wonderful book about this just on the eve of the First World War. And he was looking at ressentiment in Russian culture and literature, and he found a lot of this in the heroes of Dostoevsky, for instance. You look at the famous Подпольный человек, the underground man, or Smerdякov, many heroes from the Dostoevsky's novels. And indeed, looking at the psychological state of the Russian political class, of Vladimir Putin, I see the hero of Dostoevsky. I see the same Подпольный человек, the same underground man. If you remember, there's a wonderful short text by Dostoevsky, and that's like a confession of this St. Petersburger, some anonymous man from St. Petersburg, living in this, always cold, always cloudy city, and, living in permanent hatred of the outside world. And he has heard the news that in London, there is a time of the World Expo in London, they have built the Crystal Palace. And he hates the Crystal Palace as the image of the world harmony. And just because world harmony is unattainable, you cannot reach it. So, he says that, I'm just, I spit on your world harmony. I'm just, pass by it, and I show it, the middle finger in my pocket as I pass by this Crystal Palace. So this is the kind of this underground man, подпольный человек. And now talking about Russian politics these days, I see the manifestation of this. The kind of the inner grievance, the kind of feeling of the unjust humiliation, of the insult. But this is coming largely from the political class, and indeed I think also largely from the psychological complexes of one man at the top. Because living in Russia in the 1990s, the time which they tell us was the time of the big trouble, geopolitical catastrophe, everything falling apart, the country engulfed in flames, I don't remember anything of this. We didn't feel ourselves humiliated back in the 1990s. Yes, it was a hard time. Yes, I was, standing in line for, maybe a whole night, standing to get gasoline for my car. I could sometimes, stand for 3-4 hours to get to buy bread. Yes, as a young PhD candidate, I didn't earn enough. I worked as a gypsy cab. I was driving my car, earning my money around Moscow. But I didn't feel unhappy. And so many people around me did not. It was a time of opportunity. People were picking up the businesses. People were, trying to participate in the privatization gambles. And, it was a time of entrepreneurship, a time of hardship, but also a time of hope. I remember the unprecedented freedom of the press, of the TV, the political activity, the thriving civil society. So the 1990s definitely were not the time of humiliation. But then, after 2000, after coming of the Putin to power, we are starting to get this ideas. I would say there were 3 theories which the propaganda has taught us for the past 15 years. Theory of defeat and humiliation, theory of isolation, and the conspiracy theory. So that's what they have been telling us for the past 15 years. First, the theory of defeat. They're telling us that Russia had lost in the Cold War, that we had lost the territory, that NATO had expanded, that Russia wasn't listening to Kosovo, especially the Kosovo episode was taken as a key turning point in the mind of the Russian elite, and that Russia was sidelined in the world affairs. Interestingly enough, it is pronounced by the same very people, by the same very elite, the likes of, Sergei Karaganov, Vitaly Tretyakov, whatever, who have profited greatly in this, who have been, part and parcel of this whole gamble of the 1990s, who were the ultra-liberals, who were traveling to the West, speaking openly in the West and participating in this all, Russian West détente things. Now, as the political currents have changed, they are speaking about the great feeling of loss and humiliation that was out there. This is, I think, very much ideologically induced, this whole theory of defeat. You are feeling if you want to feel defeated, you will be defeated. It's exactly about this ressentiment, the entire nation, especially the political class, that wanted to feel defeated, without noticing that Russia was really on a par with any other nation in transit, any other nation in Eastern and Central Europe, free to participate in the new reality that was building in the 1990s and the 2000s. I was also part of this. I was working with many Western institutions, participating, working with NATO, working in various EU consultancy projects. I remember the tremendous amount of money and attention spent in Russia. Russia always was accorded a special status in the conversations, in partnerships. In the early 90s, yes, it was even seriously considered Russian possible membership of NATO. Well, the idea was sidelined very early on. But anyway, Russia had a full chance to participate in the Euro-Atlantic organizations. It didn't happen largely also because of Russia's unwillingness to do so. Because Russia always wants to have a very special, a very preferential treatment, that we are a very special nation. But wait a second, why would a certain nation demand a special treatment? What are the legal preconditions for this? Even, because people like, Putin these days would like to think in terms of the Cold War, would like to think in terms of 1945, for instance, the end of the Second World War, when Stalin was sitting over the table with Roosevelt and Churchill and deciding the fates of the post-war world. So people always think that we are back in 1945, and there is a 13 million Russian army in the center of Europe. And Russia can decide with the American president and the British prime minister about the future of Europe. But this time is there no more. The Soviet project has collapsed. It has proved unviable. It has collapsed from within, not from the outside. The Soviet Union has withdrawn unilaterally from Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union does not, Russia at this point does not enjoy the economy or military parity with the United States or NATO or China for this instance. So why, on which grounds, Russia should be given a preferential treatment? Different from that of Poland, different from that, of Turkey. So it's just another nation which should be working with the West and trying to, build to move towards a more cooperative world. But rather, Russia insisted on delving deeper in its grief, in its grievance, in its memories of the great past. And therefore, we have the situation in which there was this theory of defeat was promulgated, defeat and humiliation. Another theory which is profoundly embedded in Russian political thinking is the conspiracy theory. Everything bad that's happening in Russia is the work of the outside forces. Some very common people think about the Judeo-Masonic plot, the Bilderberg Club, whatever, the extraterrestrials. The entire world is out there plotting against Russia. Now it's the Euro-Atlantic institutions and, the G7, they're sitting, and their goal for the past 5 centuries has been to occupy Russia, to divide Russia, and to take up our resources, for which we are world famous. So this is the kind of the thinking that is out there, conspiracy theory. Okay, I draw it as a parody in the minds of some, very common people. But indeed, this theory is present at the very top. And I think the first surfaced in 2004, 11 years ago, the autumn of 2004. You remember there was a terrible terrorist act in Beslan when the Chechen terrorists, on the 1st of September, the first day of school, have taken hostage the entire school in the Ingush town of Beslan. And in a rather clumsy release operation by the Russian Special Forces, about 300 kids were killed. And a terrible strategy, terrible tragedy indeed. And Putin went on TV the same evening. And strangely enough, apart from the words of grievance, he said, as if threatening somebody, that some unnamed forces want to tear Russia into parts and to get the juicy morsels of Russia, куски пожирнее, as he called it back then. And he was clearly referring to the Western powers that were feeding the Chechen terrorists so that the Chechen terrorists would break up Russia. And as a consequence of this, he, quite unexpectedly, called off gubernatorial elections in Russia. So just think of the jump, of the intellectual jump from, children taken hostage in the English village, and as a result, you cancel the governor's elections in Russia. But this gives you an insight into thinking that everything in the world is happening. It's very much Chekist thinking, right? It's the FSB, the KGB thinking. Everything in the world is happening on somebody's orders. That the Chechen terrorists are acting not because of the grievance and the neo-patrimonial regimes and the corruption and the militant Islam in the Caucasus, but because the CIA or the State Department or whoever was standing behind them ordered them to do so. And then came Maidan, the first Ukrainian Maidan, in the winter of 2004 and 2005. When fed up with the corrupt policies of the Ukrainian oligarchs, of the Ukrainian politicians, the Ukrainian people took it to the streets. Took it to the Maidan, the Independence Square in Kiev. And then once again, in Russia, the idea was that it was all carefully planned, all these orange revolutions are carefully planned somewhere in the State Department. And everyone is in, Russian political class believes that there's somebody pulling the strings behind Libya, behind Tunisia, behind Egypt, behind the first Maidan, behind the second Maidan. There's a big plotting club that is there responsible for everything that's happening in the world. So this is the conspiracy theory in Russia. And of course, in this conspiracy theory, what happened in Ukraine in 2013, 2014 was again seen as done on orders, as we call in Russia, Washingtonsky Obkom, the Washington Party Committee. Right, as they have decided that the Ukraine should be detached from Russia, join the European Union, and they have took it, brought the people to the streets of Kiev, paying them money, and there was even the parody like paying them pechenki Gosdepa, the cookies from the State Department, giving the State Department officials were giving out cookies in the streets of Kiev. So this is another part of this, ressentiment, the conspiracy theory. So a theory of defeat, a theory of humiliation, a theory of isolation of Russia, and a theory of conspiracy. And ending this whole thing, what really happens, the parody, the tragedy of today's world, is that all these theories have reified. They have translated into reality. Putin and the Russian political class were talking about isolation, and we got isolation. He got isolated in Brisbane. There's no longer the G8. There's a G7 and Putin in Milan, all by himself, examining the Tatar Parmigiano on the exhibition, the Russian exhibition in Milan. They were talking about the expansion of NATO, which was nowhere in the cards in 2013, in 2012. Now, due to Russian policy in Ukraine, we now have the actual expansion of NATO. NATO is bringing now permanent stationing of troops in the Baltic states. Finland is thinking about joining NATO. There is more NATO equipment. There is no more military exercises on the borders with Russia. So precisely because, not because NATO had this in the plans, but because Putin, by his policy, has invited this. They were fearing, like there was a paranoia of losing Ukraine, the paranoia of preserving the post-Soviet integration. Because Putin's life project, indeed, he sees himself as a collector, as a new collector of Russian lands. The new Ivan III, Ivan Kalita, the new Ivan the Terrible. Right? He wants to undo the project of the imperial breakup. For him, the loss of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So he sees his life project as the post-Soviet Eurasian integration. And of course, in this ideology, it was perceived the Ukrainian drift, the possible Ukrainian association with the European Union, which indeed would have meant nothing. It would just be a signature on paper. Ukraine could have participated in the post-Soviet integration. But in Moscow, it was seen as a red line. No way, we're losing Ukraine. And look what happened now. We have lost Ukraine. We have lost Ukraine, I think, forever. And first and foremost, not just the political class, we have lost the people of Ukraine. We have turned the brotherly nation into mortal enemies by starting a war, by raping the neighboring nation, by taking away its territory, by occupying another parts of its territory, by threatening its independence, by violating the Budapest Memorandum, by violating international law. We have alienated a brotherly nation, and we have lost Ukraine. And indeed, we also are losing Belarus and Kazakhstan, because neither of its leaders have supported Putin in this policy. They're very careful not to pronounce the support of the Russian annexation of Crimea, as China, our new imaginary geopolitical ally. Is also China. It was very careful. It was like a vote this morning in the UN Security Council. I've just checked. There was a Russian movement to support Russian humanitarian convoy to Donetsk and Lugansk. Everyone has objected, including China. Nobody believes that Russia's humanitarian convoys in Donetsk and Lugansk would be there about humanitarian assistance. So therefore, you see all of Putin's fears, the fear of isolation, the fear of geopolitical confrontation, the fear of losing Ukraine, the fear of the collapse of the Eurasian integration, they have all realized in this year and a half precisely because of this fateful move of annexation of Crimea and then starting the war with Ukraine. So this is really an amazing achievement, so to say, in quotation marks. And Russian policy, Russian foreign policy is now in tatters. And Russia itself is finding itself in a very difficult situation these days. Isolated, being surrounded by an expanding NATO, which is responding to Russian aggression in Ukraine, having lost Ukraine, having lost significant geopolitical allies in the near abroad and in China, and at the time when the Russian economy is now in the state of recession, when the oil prices have taken a deep dive and now probably heading even lower, at a time when the Russian army and the Russian state is also, the Russian state reserves are also dwindling. At the high point, we had almost $1 billion, $1 trillion in state reserves. Now we have less than $300 billion in state reserves. It's just that it will take another year, less than a year, to try to support the ruble exchange rate at its current levels. So whatever you look at, there's a lack of resources. So, and this brings back the way I have started. So the only resource of the regime now is propaganda. The only resource is TV. So this is what the ruling regime can embark on. So therefore, more propaganda is pumped and the nation is brought into a state of a permanent warfare. So there is a military psychosis all over the nation. If you have looked at the, I'll leave it aside, a sensitive part of the 9th of May, of the anniversary of the 70th anniversary of the victory in the Patriotic War, Great Patriotic War. But even the 12th of June, there was the Day of Russia. And the streets of Russian towns have been decorated by the parades of Russian moms, and the perambulators were decorated as tanks. The small Russian kids, toddlers, 1 year of age, are moved around in cities in like small copies of tanks. If you come to Moscow these days, you look at the cars, the way they're decorated. They're all sorts of signs, hate signs against Obama, against, about the victory, 1941, 1945, let's repeat our victory. And I was yesterday in Sheremetyevo. I was, wanted to bring some souvenirs, some Russian memorabilia for Jon, for my Icelandic friend. And, even there, 90% of all souvenirs are militaristic. There are all sorts of, Putin and вежливые люди, the polite people, and the kind of military psychosis into which Russia was thrown into. It's indeed the last recourse of propaganda. Turn on the Russian news these days. 90% of news will be on Ukraine. The country was moved to live in an imaginary reality. The country lives not in Russia. Russia lives inside the TV. And the TV is telling only about Ukraine. People know much better the names of Ukrainian political parties, of Ukrainian Duma deputies, of Ukrainian oligarchs than they know about Russia, than they know about their own region. Because people are fed 90% of time the propaganda about war in Ukraine. So this really, I think I have to conclude at this point. I think Jon was going to say something also about the Russian propaganda, the way it's working there. But for me, it's once again, it's interesting how everything that had happened somehow strangely fits into the perennial patterns of Russian history. So I really see this. I have to make a very sad conclusion that everything which happened in the past 25 years, the country which, well, as I am a Russian citizen, I love the country, but I really believed in this country in this past 25 years, the country to which I returned 10 years ago after living my life in the West and returning back to Moscow. So everything, this was rather a historical episode which had ended. So it is rather a historical aberration, and Russia has embarked back on its traditional ways, which we have seen in the Soviet Union, which we have seen in the Tsarist Russia. But the only difference is that now Russia does not now have the reserves, does not have the resources to pursue the kind of policy that was typical of my country for the past 500 centuries. So with this feeling of disappointment and faint hope, I have to end this presentation. Thank you.
So, yeah, I'm going to go a little bit in a different direction, but not totally from what Sergei has been talking about. In this paper, I will discuss some observations about the state of the media in Russia today, especially the many paradoxes that illiberal democracy, so-called, seems to imply. My observations will be concerned primarily with the question to what extent the public sphere, so to say, in Russia functions, whether it functions in any way similar to what is the case in Western liberal democracies. I should say at the outset that I am at this point offering reflections on observations, not trying to make a deeper analysis or conclusions about Russia's confused political reality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one or really two cases of media coverage that I think give an opportunity to contextualize some reflections about the public sphere in Russia. So First, let's think about the following case. A mainstream television station with a news profile occasionally shows critical programs where bad practices, corruption, or other critical issues are exposed. In one such program, the focus is on corruption in higher education. One particular institution is thoroughly examined in the program by recruiting people to go through an application process, doing interviews and having conversations using hidden cameras. The institution is shown to basically sell degrees to students. All applications are accepted, all students pass any exams, whatever they say or write in the exam, and so on. At the end of the program, some of the institution's leaders are confronted with various kinds of materials which show their fraud. They lamely try to find explanations or excuses, but unsuccessfully. At the end of the program, the correspondent looks sharp and responsible in comparison to a demoralized dean and rector of the guilty university or university-level institution. The television station promises to keep critically exploring important issues and exposing wrongdoing of any sort. And this is actually a real program that I'm talking about, that I watched myself. But I'm not talking about that program, I'm sort of trying to use it as an example. So what could one in general say about a television program of the sort that I've been describing? It clearly depends on the social, political, and what one could call the communicative environment. In a Western European country, the purpose and methods used might be questioned. If the story is unnecessarily sensationalized, that might raise doubts about the TV station's honesty rather than about the story itself. If the TV station is seen as serious and responsible, the story will also be perceived as an example of good journalism, where investigative zeal and critical edge go together. But in order that such an understanding can be expected, a number of tacit assumptions must be in place. First of all, one must assume that in its reporting and as a matter of general policy, the television station is interested in telling the truth and seeking to avoid error. This does not exclude occasional dishonesties or errors, of course, but it means that the general discussion offered by the television station will be what I will call truth-oriented. While it is naive to uncritically believe everything, public trust in the independence of the media means that one can take the discussion and generally what is said seriously. Is the social, political, and communicative environment in Russia different from what we have in the West? This is a complicated and tricky question, I think. But let's imagine that we are indeed watching such a program in Moscow, and that it is about one of the recent Moscow university-level institutions which offer degree programs for fee-paying students. What if you're watching the program with a native Muscovite who points out to you that the story, its content, and the chosen time of broadcast is, as Russians often say, no coincidence, and that most probably the TV station was assigned by powerful people in the presidential administration to take on this particular institution? Those in power know very well what's going on, they need to give signals that something's being done about it, and so on. The Russian then points out several characteristics of the program that may be seen as supporting his point. Especially does the final interview with the culprits seem suspicious. Why do they allow themselves to be publicly humiliated? Why is their defense so weak? And so on. Could one say something like this? In the West, this kind of involvement in the work of an independent news media is unlikely. In the Western world, the media may be swayed and bribed by private companies, for instance. The government may threaten them with legal action, but will usually not be controlled in such crude ways. In Russia, however, things like that are quite possible. It is, after all, a country with a long and rich history of official control, and so on. so I'm simply rehearsing rather common views about Russia. My feeling is, however, that this is an inadequate explanation. Not wrong, strictly speaking, though. Certainly the issue of control is important here, and Russian state institutions do have a stronger tendency to assert control over non-governmental organizations than any Western government has. But maybe one should focus on the easiness with which the native Muscovite explains why a program that to the untrained eye may seem to fit the general criteria of thorough and critical reporting is propagandistic rather than critical in nature. To read media coverage as a way to deliver a message from the government is characteristic of a Soviet way to read the media, and in some respects, at least, it may still characterize Russian understanding of journalism. Thus, Russian media offers a complicated picture of public government relations rather than objective or independent descriptions or assessment of reality, social or political, or attempts in that direction. It is here that the notion of truth-orientedness becomes important. If reporting, coverage, or official discussion is part of an official agenda, its purpose is to mediate between people and power in the sense of giving reasons for understanding governmental motivation and intention in certain ways, understanding it in certain ways. The question of whether statements or reports are true is not really the main issue at all. There is a well-known anecdote about burials of high officials by the Kremlin wall, which gives some hint at this kind of understanding. It goes like this. In the 1960s, the custom of burying dignitaries by the Kremlin wall was discontinued because there was simply not enough space there anymore. Instead, those whose position dictated that they should be buried there were cremated and the urns with their ashes placed inside the wall. Still, in news announcements, the same wording would still continue to be used. So the news announcement would say, this or that person was buried on the Red Square by the Kremlin wall, even though it did not correspond to reality anymore. Then a group of scholars from the Russian Academy of Sciences wrote to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, requesting that the wording be changed to reflect different burial customs, suggesting something like the urn with the ashes of so-and-so was placed in the Kremlin wall. The Central Committee, so the story says, rejected the proposal. Although no reason was given, it's easy to say what made this change complicated and a risky business. As Slavoj Žižek puts it in his discussion of official Soviet language, the change, this is Žižek, the change would not have been perceived as simply registering the fact that dignitaries were now cremated and their ashes placed in the wall itself. Any deviation from the standard formula would have been interpreted as a sign triggering frenzied interpretive activity. In Soviet society, the public was quite adept at interpreting signs from the government, given through the news media or any other outlets that may serve such a purpose. The Soviet Union was, as Žižek puts it, an empire of signs. Official use of language required interpretive skills where each receiver would not primarily be concerned with whether or not what was said corresponds with reality or adapting his or her understanding of the world to new information, but rather with deciphering what a phrase or a word or a whole sentence reveals about the intentions of the authorities or about changes in the balance or structure of power. In the past, the practice of Kremlinology to some extent required the interpretive skills that every Soviet citizen had acquired. Specialists outside of the Soviet Union would use complicated hermeneutic methods to draw conclusions about the power balance in the leadership or other issues inside the establishment from photographs or texts. What was a derided discipline in the West, Kremlinology, that is, was for Soviet citizens an important survival skill. In a social environment where every official gesture, statement, or view offered is seen as a key to governmental intention, the question of truth or falsity becomes irrelevant. Authors such as Hannah Arendt and George Orwell have in the past approached this issue in different ways, but what is important is not the intentional concealment of reality by propaganda, but the situation where the correspondence between language and reality ceases to be an issue, where no one understands language as being related to objective reality, but only as a complicated system of signs to reveal or conceal intention. Now, back to the story about the Moscow Institute. Given the background I've now described, how should we react to our Muscovite partner who points out that what the real reason for the reporting is? Well, perhaps one might begin by wondering whether, independently of how it happened that this correspondent was assigned to do this particular story, whether we could not simply focus on the question whether or not it gives us the truth about this particular institution. It is important whether true or false statements are being made in the narrative itself, but given that the main claims made in the program are true, the staged nature of the discussion removes the context of critical discussion, which is just as important as the reporting itself. The feeling for Russian mainstream media that I'm suggesting by this story is that the Russian skills of interpretation may not have changed all that much, even though the Soviet Empire has now been gone for a quarter of a century, or that at least such skills are easily recalled if and when the political, social, and communicative environment is transformed by the reincarnation of some Soviet practices. Indeed, the ordinary Russian citizen will still be much inclined to read media stories and media coverage as science, as a message from the government, rather than in the other way. It may be difficult to establish the correct causal order here, but in any case, there is a link between what the ordinary Russian citizen will be inclined to understand and what the authorities will actually try to do. In other words, the control of the mainstream media in an environment of message mediation rather than an independent public sphere, the communicative objectives that the authorities in each case will want to accomplish do not require tyrannical order where free news media are closed or censorship imposed. It only means that the government can make sure that the main news media constantly serve to assert its power and make the citizens aware of and familiar with their power. Last year I watched a 2-hour-long program on Russian television which gives rise to similar reflections. It was about the terrible events in Odessa at the beginning of May that year, when dozens of people burned to death, trapped in a building put on fire in central Odessa. The program was a mixture of discussion and a documentary, where a selected group of people watched the documentary with the general audience. The film was shown in parts, where the group selected to be in the studio would discuss each part during intervals. The documentary showed the movement of the pro-Ukrainian crowd in excruciating detail during the unrest in the city on May 2nd, 2014. The filmmakers wanted to show that not only had pro-Russian protesters been harassed and murdered by their opponents, but that the city authorities had been involved in a conspiracy which led to mass killings. What caught the Western eye during the program was the simple fact that in the film and the interspersed discussion, no doubts were ever voiced about the main accusation. Rather, the facts were sampled and the evidence collected, all of which seemed to confirm the conspiracy thesis. Now, while one might expect a critical discussion to involve both the arguments for and the arguments against the main thesis, this is surely a flaw common in Western media, just as in the Russian media. But there's still a difference here. I tend to see the flaw as less serious in the West than when placed in a Russian context, because of the stronger public sphere and the stronger liberal principles, which make it easier to expose bad programming, confirmation bias, and pure propaganda than it is in the Russian context, where the audience is trained to see ostensibly independent media coverage as incorporating some agenda. I began this talk by referring to illiberal democracy. What exactly does that mean? Is Russian democracy illiberal? Some Russian politicians and public figures have talked about it openly in that way. Such an idea fits the general tendency that I've been describing to deny the importance of institutional independence. My favorite public figure, whose views are both vocal and very illiberal, is one of the highest officials of the Moscow Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church, Vsevolod Chaplin. Chaplin now heads the department of the church that deals with cooperation between public and society, as it is called. Chaplin has repeatedly argued in articles and interviews that the liberal model has now been superseded by other models, where spiritual values are seen as more important than liberal values, such as individual rights, distributive justice, and so on. He was actually explaining these views in a long interview on Echo Moskvy, an independent radio station, the day before yesterday. Now, Chaplin is not a state official or a politician, but he seems to voice concerns and views that are widely shared within the church and state establishments. The idea of the illiberal has deep roots, however. While Chaplin puts it in the context of religion and spirituality, many of the criticisms of Western liberalism that he keeps referring to in his public comments also echo some of the criticisms of liberal theory that are familiar in Marxism. Therefore, the rejection of the West and of liberal points of view unites the new and the old in interesting ways. Today's illiberalism, while not Marxist, but rather inspired by nationalism and religiosity, so to say, is nourished by the historical lessons that Putin and some of his closest collaborators want to draw from Russian and Soviet history. For this reason, I think that even if the resurrection of the Soviet Union is, as Putin has said, only for the brainless to pursue, the rejection of liberalism goes hand in hand with undermining of the public sphere, in particular the independence of institutions such as the media. But then the question is simply this: how is democracy possible without a public sphere in which arguments can't be assessed on their merits and criticism expressed freely? That is to say, is illiberal democracy ever any kind of democracy? So, thank you.
So, hello everyone. Thank you first of all for the opportunity to speak here that I was given by Jón Ólafsson. My name is Maximilian Konrad. I am Assistant Professor of Political Science, or more precisely of European Studies here at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Iceland. And I have to admit that I was a bit surprised to get this invitation to speak here at this event, because I'm not at all any kind of expert on Russia. And also have to admit that my presentation is not directly about Russia, as I was invited to speak about or to share some of my reflections about, well, in a sense, developments of democracy in Europe, developments in the European Union, the growing tide of Euroscepticism for one, the growing tide of xenophobia and nationalism that we also see around Europe in different countries. And lastly, also, I wanted to share some reflections about well, something that actually connects a bit more closely to what Jon ended his speech with, namely the development that I observe in a variety of European countries, especially my own, which is Germany, to be increasingly indifferent about liberal democracy, to approach politics from a perspective that can often come across as quite illiberal, as we heard before in the Russian context. So what I want to approach in this lecture are basically three aspects or three phenomena in well, contemporary European politics that, well, we can address in isolation from one another, mostly for analytical reasons, but we also need to look at them as phenomena that go largely hand in hand. And by that I mean, for the first, this growing tide of EU skepticism that exists, well, to a large extent within a number of EU countries, but of course also beyond. The second phenomenon is this increasing tide of nationalism and xenophobia, a certain right-wing shift in politics that has been occurring for the last couple of months and years, and I guess the Danish elections yesterday were quite a strong indication of this as well. And then I want to embed this also in a discussion about, well, what could be perceived as an increasingly, well, maybe not necessarily antagonistic position towards liberal democracy, but something that I would perceive, at least in the German context, but also in a variety of other national contexts, as at best an indifferent position about liberal democracy, and at worst a somewhat or highly ambivalent position towards the need for democracy to be liberal. And again, this is actually a point where it connects back to what Jon was arguing, because of course then we need to ask the question, I mean, if democracy is illiberal, can it be described as democracy in the first place? I guess it indicates that, well, the connection with Russia isn't particularly strong, but I think it's certainly an interesting topic to discuss in connection with developments in Russia. In a sense, basically to point out that, well, this is in a sense all part of a broader process that we can observe. We do see a lot of movements around Europe that are fundamentally xenophobic, nationalistic, anti-EU, anti-elite, and so on, and that claim to be expressions of the will of the people. But they are indeed highly illiberal and very often also want to extend the scope of citizenship rights to particular groups. But I don't want to make this point too much. So basically what I want to talk about are these three, in a sense, separate but also interconnected phenomena of a growing EU skepticism, growing nationalism and xenophobia, and then lastly, growing indifference, if not outright ambivalence, towards liberal conceptions of democracy. I don't want to, by any means, imply any kind of causality here. I was asked to speak about these things in the context of, well, the topic of this seminar, which is, of course, consequences of Russian authoritarianism. I don't see any of these developments or any of these trends, phenomena, as a direct consequence of Russian policy over the last 10, 15 years. But I do find it striking that we can observe phenomena like the ones that I'm talking about, and phenomena that we've talked about before in this seminar at the same time. So I do see a broader shift. And of course, it's also important to draw attention to the fact that these are highly contextual phenomena. It's not all part of the same process, of course. I mean, in a variety of national contexts, these developments also have to be interpreted against the background of different historical experience, different cultural traditions, and things like this. So from that perspective, I do want to emphasize that, I mean, these are contextual phenomena that we also have to address as such. I do, however, also observe that there is some kind of fascination, even in Europe, at least in some circles, with the policies and positions of Vladimir Putin. This is, of course, something that we need to discuss then, hopefully also in the discussion session afterwards. But let's turn to the first point in the presentation. That is the point that I want to make about the rise of anti-EU sentiment, both in the EU and beyond, also in candidate countries. Of course, Iceland is well, a national context in which you see a lot of these developments reflected. So let's look a little bit at the EU, and to begin with, I did want to observe that the EU as it looks today is a very different place from what it was some 10 to 12 years ago. And actually, as I will talk about a little bit later, it's also a very different place from about 1 year ago, but I'll talk about that in a little while. Why do I say it was a very different place 10 to 12 years ago? Well, 10 to 12 years ago, the EU, I guess you could argue, was characterized by a lot of optimism about the future. It was preparing for, or it had actually just gone through the Big Bang enlargement. The Eastern enlargement had just admitted 10 new members, 10 Central and Eastern European countries. And of course, by now the membership has increased all the way to 28. But it wasn't only a time for big optimism because of Eastern enlargement. I mean, there's also, in a sense, a time in which a serious relaunch of European integration was discussed. I mean, let's also remember the Laeken Declaration from December 2001. Let's remember aspects such as, well, the drive to reconnect with the European citizens, to draft a European constitution, which was drafted by the Convention on the Future of Europe in 2002 and 2003. So this was, in a sense, a big moment, a big kind of relaunch of European integration. Of course, as you know, the constitutional treaty that I referred to was also never ratified because it was in fact voted down in France and the Netherlands pretty much exactly 10 years ago in May and early June 2005. But this treaty was nonetheless important, not only because it laid the foundations for, well, the treaty that has been ratified a few years later and which is enforced, the Lisbon Treaty. It was also important because it was written in an open, I would say fairly inclusive and also fairly democratic, highly transparent way. So in a sense, the French and the Dutch referenda that I referred to 10 years ago were a major setback or a crisis moment. And this is something that I would argue can also be seen as a moment that reflects an important shift in European integration. I'm not saying that this is the point that caused a shift in European integration. I think this is in a sense a longer process, but it can certainly be seen as a moment that reflects a broader shift in European integration. And this is something where theorists of European integration very often talk about a shift from what they refer to as a permissive consensus to a period of a constraining dissensus. By that they basically mean that, broadly speaking, European integration during the phase of the permissive consensus was seen as something that produced good results. Therefore, there was an overarching broad public consensus that European integration was good and was to be supported. And this period ended. And of course, I mean, you could argue that well, this primarily positive understanding of European integration had been eroding for a while. This is not a process that started with the referenda in France and the Netherlands. It possibly began with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 and 1993, possibly even before. But you could certainly say that it finally came crashing down with the Constitutional Treaty, or rather with a referenda on the Constitutional Treaty in France and the Netherlands. So since then, European integration has become increasingly controversial, and I guess that the clearest expression of this is, in a sense, this conventional wisdom that European integration or the European Union is characterized by a democratic deficit, which I actually think is a badly disguised sense of anti-integration sentiment rather than actual concern about democracy, but that's not something that I have time to go into here. Instead, I do want to focus on a number of other points which I find are the most striking consequences of this constraining dissensus in European integration. First of all, there's now a discourse on the EU as a threat to the nation state. And you can guess that, I mean, this already then connects to the second topic that I want to address, namely the point about this rise of nationalism, this right-wing shift, this increasing tendency towards xenophobia and things like this. So there is now a discourse on the EU as a threat to the nation state. So the EU is construed as, well, something that is often referred to as a power-sucking entity that deprives nation states of their sovereignty. And such claims are often voiced in a highly shrill way, usually from actors on the edges of the political spectrum. But even there we can observe an interesting development, because those claims are gradually, and this is also not a process that necessarily started in 2005, but gradually those arguments are gaining traction also within political camps closer to the center of the political spectrum. And this has then, of course, caused significant problems for many of the, well, what's often referred to as the old parties that have traditionally been pro-integration. So in a whole number of countries, this is a phenomenon that can be observed, and this has, of course, then also had an impact on the rise of right-wing populism throughout the EU. Second, and maybe more importantly, there's now also a discourse, well, it's actually almost a little bit more, it has also almost become a conventional wisdom that European integration is an elite project. It's a project that is driven by political and business elites, not a popular project, and consequently it's something that serves primarily, if not exclusively, the interests of political and business elites, and therefore disregards well, the interests of the common people, has very little to offer for the average people, according to the discourse, of course. This last point is actually important, because this is also something that gives rise to this fundamentally populist anti-integration agenda that we have been observing for a number of years. And this is a fundamental problem that the EU has needed to deal with, at least since the French and Dutch referenda. As a matter of fact, I mean, if you look at the Commission's immediate response to the referenda 10 years ago, well, that was to launch a period of reflection, which basically had the ambition not only to reflect about how the EU was to develop, how the EU should be, how things could be done differently, but also to find better ways of communicating the benefits of European integration to the citizens, basically to point out better, well, what this whole project is actually for. What are the causes of this anti-integration turn then? Of course, somewhat difficult to speculate about, but of course this also has to be seen as a phenomenon that is quite specific in the time where it emerged, which is of course the phase where, again, enlargement took place, where aspects such as the so-called finality debate was relevant, where aspects such as the debate about deepening and widening European integration is relevant. So basically questions about, well, what is actually the ultimate, the final limit of European integration? When is European integration complete? How many more members do we have to accept? What is Europe in the first place? And this is, of course, then also a discussion about money. I mean, this is a discussion about concerns about, well, how many more poor states do we have to accept and do we have to pay for? Of course, I mean, again, those aren't my words. I mean, this is, of course, kind of the arguments that are made within this discourse. Second, an important reason was concerns about how much freedom the four freedoms impose on the member states. And of course, here I'm being a little bit polemical. Because, I mean, the four freedoms, the free movement of people, goods, services, and capital, I mean, this is, of course, the founding idea of European integration. But more recently, this has also come to be seen as an imposition on the member states. That is, the free movement of, well, these four freedoms of movement also imply that, well, in the post-enlargement European Union, this will mean that a lot of people from poor countries will come into the richer states, which will overburden the welfare states, and which seriously affects the cost-benefit analysis of European integration. So this is also something that causes this rise in anti-integration sentiment. And there I also see a notable shift in my own country, in Germany, where European integration has traditionally been, in a sense, the raison d'etre of the Bonn Republic, at least. And I would say even of the Helmut Kohl years after the turn to the Berlin Republic. So even in the better part of the 1990s. This is something that has changed quite fundamentally. So in Germany, you see a growing tide of Euroscepticism. This is also something that has been going on for the last 10, 15 years, something like this. And what's striking in this context is that we see a fading importance of normative justifications for European integration. For people like Helmut Kohl, but also for people like Konrad Adenauer in the very beginning of the Bonn Republic, European integration was something that Germany had to be committed to as a matter of historic obligation. And that kind of sense of normative justification has faded quite significantly. There's much more instrumental justification, much more cost-benefit calculation, much more about the question of, well, is this actually something that is good for Germany? We have to pay so much for it. What do we get out of it? And this would be an argument that was, in a sense, not particularly popular in the Kohl years because, well, there was this predominance of normative justification. And this is, of course, something that plays out in a highly nasty way in the discourse about the Greek deficit crisis. What to do with Greece in the context of, well, of its debt crisis, which is a discussion that is, of course, extremely salient in Germany these days. It also has to do with reunification. Reunification has also had an impact on the way European integration is perceived. And even Angela Merkel has a role to play in this context because, again, she's not the committed European, the kind of bleeding heart European that Helmut Kohl was. Well, actually, Gerhard Schröder wasn't either for that perspective. So we see the emergence of a Eurosceptic party for the first time, which is also a failure of political leadership because it's basically an effect of well, basically allowing this to happen, which I will talk about in a second when I talk about the right-wing shift that we observe not only in Germany, but of course also in a lot of other places in Europe. So connected to the rise of Euroscepticism around the EU, we also see a profound right-wing shift. Most of all, the rise of far-right and right-wing populist parties. And I do want to make the distinction between the two. I think there's actually something that, from a political science perspective, we need to make this kind of distinction because there's a difference between the kind of far-right neo-fascist parties like Golden Dawn in Greece and the kind of right-wing populist parties to which I would even count the Sweden Democrats or the Alternative for Germany. But that's a different point. It's just kind of my criticism that we're throwing around this label of fascist quite easily these days without actually thinking about what fascism actually means. But anyways, as a consequence of these developments, as a consequence of this right-wing shift in European politics, we also see the adoption of more radical positions by center-right parties that were previously considered quite mainstream. Look, for instance, at the impact that the United Kingdom Independence Party has had on the policy position of the British government, on David Cameron in matters of European integration. In this context, in the German context, we can also say, well, Angela Merkel has also made a strategic mistake in the sense that her predecessors as chairman of the German Christian Democratic Party always had the declared ambition not to allow any democratic party is important, not to allow any democratic party to the right of the Christian Democrats. And this has had the impact that, I mean, since there was no option to vote for any other democratic party on the right side of the political spectrum, it has had the strategic advantage that, well, it's a way of integrating and at the same time silencing right-wing populists. And kind of that position has been given up by Angela Merkel. This has alienated, in a sense, right-wing populists from the Christian Democratic Party and thus helped the emergence of a completely new party, the so-called Alternative for Germany. And I would say it has even quite possibly aided the emergence of Pegida, the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But remember that I said in the very beginning that the EU also looks quite different today than it did a year ago. In saying so, I'm referring to the European Parliament elections in 2014. This is, of course, a moment that has also quite dramatically shown us the extent of this right-wing shift in European politics. I do, however, want to say that this shift, the shift that we can observe in these elections, was not primarily a shift from left to right. As a matter of fact, I mean, majorities in the European Parliament haven't shifted all that dramatically. I mean, the European People's Party, which is the party group of the conservative pro-European integration parties, I mean, that party group had been the biggest party group in the European Parliament already in the previous period between 2009 and 2014. However, the fairly dramatic shift has taken place more or less on the right side of the political spectrum. We see a shift from, well, in a sense, the traditional, the mainstream right to the radical right. And in the EU, this also means a shift towards the anti-integrationist camp. I mean, you see election successes of the UK Independence Party, Front National in France, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, Alternative for Germany in Germany, and things like this. Front National ended up being the biggest party in the French EP elections, 25%, whereas 20 years ago, under Jean-Marie Le Pen, most people wouldn't have touched that party with a pair of pliers even. UKIP is the biggest party in the UK. The Golden Dawn, which is an actual neo-fascist party, got almost 10% of the vote in Greece. The True Finns, 13% in Finland. Sweden Democrats, 10%, which is also shocking from the Swedish perspective. So the list is long. And of course, it means that the EP, the European Parliament, is a very different place today than it was before these elections. It now has many members representing not only right-wing populist positions, but even far-right positions. We do, however, also see an interesting development as this shift to the right, or the shift to the radical right, rather, has also brought about a closer coalition of the pro-integration forces. So in a sense, we see an opposite movement as well, a shift towards the center, because the Socialists and Democrats, the European People's Party, and the Liberals work together on a number of points. And the clearest expression of this, or the most obvious expression of this, has been the election of the Commission President in 2014, who was elected with the help of votes from the Social Democrats and the Liberals, even though he was, of course, the candidate of the conservative European People's Party. But of course, he was even less liked by parties on the far left and the far right. The bottom line is, however, that these developments reflect not only a shift against the EU, but also to the parties, to the edges of the party system. Very shortly, my last point is about this development away from liberal democracy, this increasing and quite concerning, from my perspective at least, concerning indifference about the importance of liberal democracy. So I see in many places in Europe an increasing tendency where people turn their backs on liberal democracy, where they don't find it particularly important that democracy is liberal. This can, in a sense, maybe also be construed as well, the clearest parallel to what Jon was saying before, but also the clearest parallel that we can draw between the situation in the EU, whether at the European or at the member state level, and the Russian context. Again, I mean, the observations that I'm making are strongly connected to one another, and they cannot be seen in isolation from one another. But I do want to look at this element of indifference about liberal democracy in a bit of detail. We see the emergence of radical parties at the national level, at the European level, such as the Golden Dawn in Greece, which I've referred to before, Jobbik in Hungary. Those developments indicate a turn away from liberal democracy. This is actually also something, if we discuss the Hungarian context, then of course we need to discuss to what extent Hungary, from today's perspective, could be considered part of the West that Jon was referring to in the way media function in the West. There's good reason to say that, well, this is actually quite a clear move away from this. But anyways, another good indication of this turn away from liberal democracy that I see is the rise of the Pegida movement in Germany. So I want to spend 1 or 2 minutes on this. if you think about liberal democracy under threat, Germany is probably not exactly the first place that comes to mind, because there's certainly points or places that need to be discussed first. However, it is quite noteworthy, well, in a sense, I guess you could argue this is precisely why this emergence of Pegida is so noteworthy, because in a sense, it seems like it came out of nothing, because you would think of Germany as a consolidated democracy with, firmly, deeply ingrained fundamental democratic values. And of course, I mean, if you look at this beyond the surface or kind of underneath the surface, then you will also see that it's actually not something that comes out of nowhere. It is actually a development that has very much to do. It's very closely connected to some structural problems in East German civil society. That is actually a problem of a lack of, in a sense, the consolidation of basic democratic values in East Germany. And therefore, it is also very importantly to a significant extent a regional problem. But what was striking about this was that, well, in a consolidated democracy, all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, you have 20,000, 30,000 people walking against, well, a lot of things that they didn't like. But the basic point that was agreed on was, well, there's this process of Islamization. Actually, both of these protests took place in Saxony, which has a Muslim population of 0.4%. Yet Islamization was considered to be a huge problem there. And the most striking aspect here is of course the numbers. East German regions are not the only regions in Europe that have problems with neo-Nazis, of course, but all of a sudden there's 20,000 or 30,000 people that walk for the same causes with neo-Nazis, right-wing extremists, convicted criminals at the forefront and things like this. And this is probably why this is such a, in a sense, such a dramatic development. Even though it is virtually impossible to come up with a coherent image of what these movements actually want, apart from the fact that they're dissatisfied with something, that they're anti-establishment, that they're anti-multiculturalist, that they're intolerant, that they have strong xenophobic undertones, even though they're always very keen on emphasizing that they're not, in fact, racist. And this is, again, where it connects to Jon's speech, that they are strongly critical of the press, that they say from the beginning everything that you read in the press is lies, what they say about us as a movement and things like this. At the same time, or actually as a consequence, there's also a complete refusal to engage in any discussions with the so-called liar press. So the frightening part, and what is interesting for us, is this apparent willingness of average people to march for whatever concerns alongside neo-Nazis and convicted criminals, to point out that there is a process of Islamization of the West, which has very little basis, and that this, well, I guess the bottom line being that, well, the frightening part is precisely this point, that this is something where average citizens and neo-Nazis rally and gather 20,000 people to march for very diffusely defined purposes. So what we see is a deeply anti-democratic impulse, a failure to acknowledge and respect diversity. It's basically a demonstration of a lack of fundamental democratic values, a failure to want to engage in any kind of debate or dialogue, apart from the fact that this is a movement that brands political elites as liars and so on. So, just to briefly summarize this, because then we also need to have some time for discussion, I do see three phenomena that are closely connected to one another. First of all, this rise of EU skepticism, which to a large extent has to do, of course, with the EU's internal development, with the increasing size of the internal market, but which therefore is also very closely connected to rising xenophobia, rising right-wing extremism. I mean, these are basically, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. But, and this is maybe the most important point, we also see this increasingly ambivalent attitudes, at least in some circles, or actually in many member states, regarding the basics of liberal democracy. And of course, needless to say, again, these are highly complex phenomena, highly contextual, they have different sources, different expressions in different places, and therefore, of course, quite likely also different remedies. But it's, of course, very important to, in a sense, take this transnational perspective to this and then, well, discuss the causes and consequences. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you to all our speakers today. Before I open the floor up to questions, I just wanted to maybe reflect a little bit on the three excellent talks we heard here today, and maybe start lastly with Maximilian's points about maybe in particular what is close to me right now is the increased nationalism and xenophobia in Europe. When yesterday my adoptive country of Denmark, where every fifth person voted for the Danish People's Party, and how that maybe links to what you were saying about sort of indifference about the importance of liberal democracy and Jon's comments about illiberal democracy in the Russian context. Because, and this is just a speculation, I can imagine Russians who would say, look, this is what democracy also brings. Like, you just have to deal with the consequences of democracy, but democracy is not always, you know, a good thing. And perhaps the engineered elections that we see in Russia, where the Russian phrasing is so wonderful, you have vыборы без выбора, which just means elections without choice, but everybody participates in this sort of political theater, and sort of, you know, that's the type of democracy that seems to work for a lot of Russians, whether we call it illiberal or we call it managed or sovereign democracy. We've heard a lot of definitions over the past 25 years. And I found it extremely interesting to listen to Sergei Medvedev's sort of overview of the post-Soviet period. And I found myself, when you were talking about the 1990s and you talked about how you did not feel humiliated at all, I wrote down in my notebook, but did you feel disappointed? And then you came out with the sort of 25 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, that now is this feeling of sadness and disappointment for where this experiment, this post-Soviet sort of period of, and I agree with you, like a period of hope, a period of sort of things are changing, everything's possible, the entrepreneurship is sort of making things possible for, well, I would say some not necessarily ordinary people, also people with some privilege in society. But I mean, my look at the 1990s, I would still say that some of the tendencies that you're talking about with, you know, and I really liked the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that everything that Putin has, you know, propagated for is sort of becoming true. But already in 1998, when the economy collapsed in Russia, Russia felt this sort of shock of isolation, nobody coming to back them up. I remember that being maybe a little bit of a psychological shock for the Russian population at the time. And I really also liked the sort of, when you talk about the psychosis, the military psychosis, and people celebrating 12th of June with kids' prams dressed up in tanks. And then I thought about what Jon was saying in terms of the official language and how important what an important skill it is in Russia to be able to read and sort of decipher the media. And I really don't want to be the person who advocates for this sort of lack of agency, but do you think maybe you're also overestimating this, you know, capacity of the Russian people? Because there's also the argument that people internalize the official language and sort of, you know, start to operate as sort of intellectual beings within the discourse, and they're not really capable of looking outside of it. I know this is a hugely debated field, and I'm not advocating for one side or the other, but these are just some of the thoughts that came to my mind while listening to these 3 talks. And I don't know if you want to comment or if we should take a couple of questions first and then move on. We have 15 minutes for some questions, so I'll take a couple of questions from the audience and then we can give the speakers some time. Please. Yes?
My name is Inge Bjarnason. I don't know much about this, so I have pure interest to learn. And this comment about that the Russian public is very good to read in between the lines of media sounds like I could. It seems that they are maybe in some way smarter than Western public. So I thought that was a point of hope. But what worries me listening to you is maybe you, Sergei, is that it seems that all the blame is put on this one man, and it just sounds so simple interpretation. I'm sure I'm not quite interpreting right, what you're saying, but at least in Western media, this is seems to be a common theme to put all the blame on this one man. And you talk about that you don't know, you don't understand your nation anymore. How does one go about read the thought of a nation? And it's nice to have some hope, for the future. So, what does the Russian nation have some dreams? Where do they want to go?
Well, I understand this is more or less a question to me. About Putin, I think it's a perennial, like sociologists always argue about structure and agency, which comes first. Is this like Tolstoy was writing War and Peace about it, Napoleon and War and Peace. So would have war happened, would have Borodino battle happened if Napoleon didn't have his small cold in the morning, and so on. Putin, in a sense, is a political genius. I think much of the change which happened is because he got in resonance, he got in tune with the big change of mood in the public. It's not, of course, his own phantasms. It's not, of course, his own dreams. The nation, as I mentioned, was... look, it's not that I don't know my nation. I don't recognize, I didn't expect, I knew that these currents, that the trends are in there, but I didn't expect them to resurface so sharply and so visibly in such a short time. Like, for instance, you probably haven't watched, but for the Russian observers, you would be familiar with films by Alexei Balabanov, a wonderful Russian filmmaker. I think he has made the key movies about Russia in the 1990s and in the 2000s. And he was making his films about the Russian subconsciousness, the Russian myths and archetypes. And back 15 years ago, his heroes were saying that, yes, we will revenge for Sevastopol. Ukraine, we thought this is some kind of the political trolling, right? We thought it's some kind of the epitage thing. He wanted to appear like a Russian fascist. But then 15 years after, it strikes back. It comes into reality. People still say, yes, we missed Sevastopol all these years. Sevastopol is finally Russian. So you see, it was in there, but we probably thought that it's some kind of the passing nature, that it's the residual post-imperial complex, the residual post-imperial nostalgia. But then what Putin did, he got in tune with this post-imperial nostalgia. He actualized this, and he made it his political base, his political legitimacy, right? That's something which supports his power. And this is very powerful, right? This is very, it's like, you know, excuse this comparison, I'm not making direct comparisons with Russia today and Germany 1920s but 1930s. But let's look back. What is this? Is it like common German sentiment, or is it Hitler that made Germany the way it was in 1930s? It's a little bit philosophical debate. It's both. Because, you know, the Germans were also there. You know, if you read Günter Grass, the tin drum, right? It's, you look at suddenly the nation falling into infancy, right? And for being for good 30 years like a nation of infants. Before, you know, the final collapse of the Second World War in the Nuremberg, which ensued. So, if it were not for Hitler, would Germany have turned Nazist? We don't know. Probably yes, and probably not. So it's both ways. So in Russia today, I think it's the objective trajectory of the nation. Maybe we have to go through this whole round of Putinism, of war with Ukraine, of confrontation with the West. It will be the last act of drama in the fall of the Russian Empire, right? That we have to live through this before finally coming to grips with the modern world, before, you know, finding ourselves as just another normal nation state, not as a nation that dreams itself, that, you know, conjures up itself as an empire, cannot think about itself outside the imperial context. So I don't know, maybe 100 years later, when, you know, historians will write history books, they'll say, okay, Russia had to go through this period of Putinism to finally come to grips with this post-imperial accommodation. You know, some needed in a harsher format, some in easier format. Like France had to go through the humiliation of Algiers and, you know, the exodus of Pied Noir to France, you know, to come to grips with the loss of empire. Britain had to go through the episode, the Falkland episode, and, you know, with Maggie Thatcher and this whole thing to finally, once again, also to come to grips with the loss of empire. So it happens differently in various post-imperial nations, but I hope that the Ukraine episode will be the last rock on which the teeth of Russian imperialism will be broken. And that Russia will come back to normalcy, come back to normal world, and that this will be, that's probably some historical logic in all this.
Can I ask a question? You know, my name is Alexei Shatsky, I'm from Russian Embassy, and I'm Army, just to be honest, and you know, but you told about the empire in which point of view, the empire in the philosophic point of view, or the empire that's it's a type of state. And another thing, you told about a lot about the 90s. You know, I can remark about these times because I've been in Russia at that time and I can remember very well that liberals, so-called liberasti, took the power that time, and Democrats, they called them Democrats, and the people called them another way, you know, that's Koproprats in Russia. And they took the power, and the head of the Democrats, Yegor Gaidar, said at that time that, you know, these 15, 18 millions of pensionists is a ballast for our country. What wasn't it the fascism? So 15, 18 million people of ballast died out, just died out. And it was a very hard time at that time. It was a rubbish time. It was a very rubbish time, and it was a very difficult time for the ordinary people, for only few men could manage to catch the money from the fallen Soviet Union at that time. And you say there was a time of opportunity for thieves. It was the time of opportunity for thieves, not for the population. And I can remember this time it was a very, very sad, very difficult time for everyone, except some thieves. that time. It's not that, you know, this, I can agree with Jon that we have a liberal democracy. Illiberal because we don't accept the liberalism, that type of this, you know, it's, liberalism in Russia means Malthusianism. No thanks, no more. We had this in 10 years of this regime. No more, no thanks. If you want to have some experiment so please find another country for the experiments. We have the communist experiments, experiment in Trotsky type and the Stalin type, and this liberal experiment in Yeltsin and Yegor Gaidar type. No thanks. Do you want to experiment? Just find another country for experiments. And you as a historian should understand this politics, that history is a politics turned to the past. And if we do not recognize our history and try to preserve our history, so we will lose our future, we will lose our present. That's why the 70th anniversary of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, was celebrated in such a way. And about the listening in reading between the lines and the Russian, for Russian, for Western truth-orientated media in Western countries. Could you say to me what the Western media said about Iraq chemical weapon in 2002, 2003, and what it was said about the Strauss-Kahn? Now it's another things, but every Western media said about it. But if somebody wanted to say another thing, it was just keep inside.
We have only 3 minutes left, sorry, but I think we should give each of the panelists a chance to just comment in the end. Thank you. So Sergey.
Okay, thanks for wonderful revelation. History is politics turned into past. I noted down. Is it an official pronouncement? Or did you take it from where did you take it from? But which one? Can you give me a quote? Because that's a wonderful thing. I mean, that's a terrible pronouncement as a historian. History is memory. History is archives. History is fact turned into past. And that's precisely the corruption of history that is done by Putin regime, which is politics turned into past. And therefore, we have this awful debates about victory, about Second World War, because it is politicizing history. So thanks for revealing this. It's really, you couldn't have found a more appropriate quotation for this kind of corruption of history and memory, which has happened in today's Russia. Now as to the 90s and, sorry, I didn't interrupt you, let me respond. Now as to the 90s and the 2000s. Well, first, I don't know why you addressed all this criticism to me. I didn't label myself as Democrat, I didn't label myself as liberal. Indeed, I think that people who labeled themselves as Democrats and liberals were indeed direct heirs of the Soviet nomenclatura and the continuers of Soviet nomenclatura. Secondly, the ruling party today is the direct descendant, who is Putin after all? He is the Democrat of the 1990s, right? He was the aide of Anatoly Sobchak. Who are all the profiteers of Putin regime? What is the cooperative Ozero? Where did they come from? Not from this privatization of the 1990s. But I'll tell you the difference between the 1990s and today. Because today is 1990s magnified by 10 times. The theft of today. 1990s, they're like kindergarten. The same Koch, Chubais, all these people there. They were taken, their private gain was 5, maybe 10%. Today people are stealing 100% of the budget, right? So the kind of theft, the kind of the kind of decay, the social decay that is happening these days. Have you ever checked? I know maybe it's not the figures to be checked in the embassy in Iceland, but the number of hospitals that were closed down, that are closed down in Russia, the number of schools which are closed down in Russia. Have you checked the Russian budget, the way it looks today? How much is allocated for social expenditure? How much is allocated for war? It's a budget of genocide. The current authorities, not the 1990s, are doing the genocide of the Russian population. The average life expectancy, despite the 15 years of oil bonanza, the average life expectancy is going down. The entire social infrastructure is collapsing, is failing. So all this oil wealth of the last 15 years were wasted for Putin's buddies and for the theft of the state budget, for staging the war in Crimea, the war in Ukraine, for staging this worthless Olympics, for building the bridge to Crimea. This is not, 1990s compared to the theft is nothing. So that's what I have to say about the 1990s and today. I'm not, the biggest fan of the 1990s, but the kind of the misappropriation of budgetary fund were just nothing compared to what's happening in today's Russia. So probably you'll have something to reply about, the truth in the Western media.
Well, do you? What's something?
I mean, I just maybe very briefly. One thing that I noticed in the discussion is that we don't actually clarify, or we seem to have some confusion about what we mean by liberal versus illiberal democracy versus market liberalization. I think they're very different things that we're talking about, and well, I guess we don't have actually the time to go into that. Maybe the one question about expectations that you should have towards democracy. I mean, where you said the question before. I mean, maybe this is what Russians would say. Well, this is what you have to expect when you get democracy. I think. I can't comment on that, but I can comment on the fact that developments in East Germany, for instance, but I'm sure it also applies to a lot of other post-communist contexts, have very much to do with disenchantment with democratic development, because people have certain expectations when countries democratize, and they're very, in many cases, very difficult to fulfill. I guess most people in post-communist contexts, when they hear about democracy, or when they discuss democracy as an ideal to strive for, they think most of all of things like freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, but maybe most importantly prosperity. And if you look at the East German context, that's just simply not what happened. And this is a very important aspect in why people become indifferent or even antagonistic towards democracy, because expectations are disappointed quite fundamentally. You expect that, life will be the same in East Germany as it has been in West Germany for the last 4 or 5 decades. Well, then all of a sudden you're faced with huge unemployment, 25% in certain regions, neo-Nazis and things like this. So, that's certainly a very important point to discuss.
We have this cycle of hope, disillusion, and disappointment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, about liberal democracy, maybe first. What I have in mind is liberalism and democracy are not necessarily the same thing. It can be different. You can talk about democracy as something different than liberalism and so on. But the way, the kind of understanding I'm putting into liberalism, and maybe I should have said something more precise about this, is that liberalism imposes on democracy certain basic principles that have to do with rights, justice, and several other basic values. My suspicion is that if you want to get rid of liberalism, you will end up getting rid of democracy as well. So that, I think, is the challenge that illiberal democracies such as Russia, Hungary, maybe other countries face. The views you are expressing are precisely the same views that I was citing from Vsevolod Chaplin, the church hierarch who has repeatedly sort of tried to give the exposition of the new kind of governmental policies that he thinks should characterize Russia. He thinks he sees it in China, and he actually takes the Islamic states as a good example of spiritually inspired policies. So I think, as I said, even though a person like Chaplin is not someone who speaks governmental policy, he gives us a very good and very worrying, I think, sort of view of what is becoming the reigning policy in Russia. And maybe, I agree with Rosa and Sergei on the lack of ideology in a way, but still there is some movement towards something you could call a spiritual ideology and so on. And I mean, I hear people like Alexei and many others I know in Russia who are trying to conceptualize such a view on society. For me, it's extremely worrying, simply. And I would ask, I mean, if the communist experiment didn't work very well, we know that. Now we hear that the so-called liberal experiment of the 90s didn't work very well either. So now something is working very well. I don't really see it actually, and I think the facts that Sergei was citing, and things we can read in publications in Russia, luckily yet by many opponents of the Putin government, point to similar things: theft, bribery, corruption on a scale unprecedented, even in the worst Soviet times. So whatever we want to say about the past, I don't think we can settle on some bright picture of what's happening today. And just finally about truth-orientedness, I did not mean that the Western media speaks the truth. That would be very naive. What I meant was simply that there is a context of discussion about the media, which means that the lies that are produced by the media tend to evoke different kinds of discussion in the West rather than in the East. In Russia, the idea of free discussion in many people's minds is chaos and confusion, and this is because the media, I think the mainstream media, and this has also to do with the government, of course, is responsible for bringing a lot of assigned disinformation. Now, I mean, we could, I guess, argue about what that means for the rest of the day, but that's what I'm trying to say. I see oriented disinformation as very much part and parcel of what the mainstream Russian media is about today, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much, Jon. I think that this discussion could continue and perhaps can here afterwards. I think that we've seen very clearly also now in the discussion that if the historian may speak, Russia is still searching for its place in the world. It really is trying to identify where it fits and what it should be, and that will continue probably for a long time. But I say, I think my role here is over, so thank you very much. I don't know if Jon wants to conclude or... I think I'll conclude, so thank you very much for coming. Thanks to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.